Member Dr. Reeves from California for 5 minutes of questions. Or more.
For more than 5 months, under the guise of investigating the origins of the novel coronavirus, the Select Subcommittee has scrutinized the drafting and publication of the Proximal Origin paper. The Select Subcommittee has demanded thousands of pages of internal documents from researchers involved in the paper, conducted transcribed interviews with these researchers, subpoenaed their private communications, and now called 2 of them to testify at today's hearing. We have undertaken all of this work, but to what end? Has targeting these researchers and probing the publication of this paper meaningfully advanced our efforts to prevent and prepare for future pandemics? Or has it been about fishing for evidence to prove their confirmation bias, their theories, with the goal of advancing a predetermined partisan narrative targeting Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, and our nation's scientists and public health officials? Dr. Anderson, let me ask my first question to you. In your view, as a leading virologist who studies emerging pathogens, has the Select Subcommittee's examination of your paper done anything to prevent and prepare our nation for the emergence of future novel viruses?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, Dr. Gary, same question to you. Has the Select Subcommittee's examination of the Proximal Origin paper done anything to prevent and prepare our nation for the emergence of future novel viruses?
Not to this date.
Okay. When I joined the Select Subcommittee as ranking member, I hoped that we could work together on the challenging but critically important mission of identifying forward-looking solutions to prevent and prepare for future pandemics. You know, I'm an emergency medicine physician. I want actionable items to do something that will help relieve pain, suffering, and save lives. I take that doctor's approach in my work in Congress, and I want to do meaningful work that will help save lives, prevent a future pandemic, and prepare for the future pandemic. And this included taking a serious look at whether SARS-CoV-2 emerged from a natural zoonotic transfer or from a research-related incident, so that we could propose substantive policies to prevent the emergence of the next deadly novel airborne virus. But instead of examining this question seriously and objectively, the Select Subcommittee has so far only leveraged it to target our nation's scientists and to vilify our nation's public health officials. And in doing so, the Select Subcommittee has undermined the critical mission of preventing and preparing for future pandemics. As a result of unproven conspiratorial accusations without proof, like those suggesting Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins covered up the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, trust in science and our nation's public health institutions has suffered. The Pew Research Center found that fewer than 3 in 10 Americans have a great deal of confidence in scientists to act in the public's interest. So while manufacturing of distrust is largely happening along party lines, it will hurt us all and our public health in the long run, whether you are Republican, Democrat, or Independent. And we are already seeing the consequences. For example, threats against scientists and public health officials have surged in the wake of these accusations, which could have long-term impacts on our ability to cultivate a strong and growing workforce to protect our public health, to work during the next pandemic. Dr. Anderson, you've been the subject of these threats. Could you please describe the threats and harassment you've experienced since the publication of the Proximal Origin paper?
I'll say the paper itself has not resulted in threats. However, the misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories around the paper have resulted in significant harassment and threats, including everything from typical targets on social media, to emails, to telephone calls, to my office, to my own phone, to death threats.
Can you give an example of one of those death threats to you and yours?
Of course. One example, for example, will be online where there are so-called kill lists. And I have found myself on those lists together with my co-authors, together with many other colleagues involved in anything from origin research to vaccine research. For example, Peter Hotez has been a frequent target of many of these same
And do they
threats.
say why they want to harm you?
I think the conspiracy theory here, which is amplified by the Sub-Select Committee's majority here, is that basically that the virus was created and that American scientists played a role in that and have been covering that up. And the suggestions that there have been quid pro quos in turn of covering this up, all of which, as the record clearly shows, is false. And these themselves result in these.
And so that these manufactured conspiratorial accusations without that proof instills these emotions from the public that listens to them and results in an aggressive, threatening environment for you and other scientists?
Correct, and I think understandably so, because we have all lived through a devastating pandemic with a lot of personal consequences to a lot of different people, and we're all suffering and hurting. And I think the focus has been on there is a need to blame somebody for this. There's a need to deflect from our own personal suffering, and this has been part of that.
And so how does this kind of harassment undermine the ability of scientists to do critical work that helps to promote our understanding of emerging public health threats?
I think it sets a terrible example for future scientists looking at the attacks directed against us, for example. And if I was a future scientist and looking at that and saying, like, maybe I'm not going to go into infectious disease research. If I'm an emergency care physician or a nurse saying maybe infectious diseases is not for me because I've seen all the different harassments going on here. So from that perspective is damaging. It's also incredibly damaging to our own work. We do study the origins of pandemics, including this one, but myself and Dr. Gary next to me, we study a lot of different viruses, together with colleagues in Africa, for example, and these viruses continue to pose threats, and of course, that work is less active than it would have been.
So confirmation bias is when you already are convinced 100% of a certain outcome, and your worldview will now be seen through a lens of that belief. And so regardless of the facts and the evidence presented to you, you will formulate that based on what your already preconceived notion is, and you will work to prove what you already believe exists. How does that harm our public health researchers in this investigation when people are continuing to push a narrative that involves intimidating public health scientists by bringing them here, yelling at them, accusing them if they're not aligned with their confirmation bias, with their preconceived notion?
I think it's deeply unhelpful.
As a physician and public health expert, I am deeply troubled that the Select Subcommittee has prioritized its time and resources on advancing an extreme partisan narrative over fulfilling our obligation to the American people to mitigate future public health threats. And so I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to cease their misguided efforts that endanger science and public health, and I yield back.
Before I recognize the next witness, with unanimous consent, want to submit for the record a working paper from 26 May 2020, Critical Analysis of Anderson et al., The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, written by scientists at Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Center for Military Intelligence. I now recognize Ms. Malliotakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Dr. Anderson, do you believe that the former CDC director, Dr. Redfield, is a conspiracy theorist? Yes or no? Yes or no?
I think to the question of whether the former director is a conspiracy theorist is not really something I have thought about. So
Well, I don't know,
like
because
to
you
label
just
people
accused
as such.
everyone who believes that there was a lab leak to be a conspiracy theorist. And back in March, the former director of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, came before this committee, and he said that it was not scientifically plausible that the virus went from a bat to humans and subsequently became one of the most infectious viruses in history. When asked why he was excluded from the February conference call that both of you, as well as 10 other scientists, had with Dr. Fauci, Dr. Redfield told us that Dr. Fauci wanted a single narrative surrounding the origins of COVID. But both you and Anderson Gary also expressed concerns about the genetic makeup of the virus just days before the initial draft of this paper came out. So were you both conspiracy theorists at that time? On January 29, 2020, Dr. Fauci emailed you after you had expressed concerns to him on a phone call that you believed COVID would have been engineered. He told you that if this was true, you had to contact the FBI. You did not do that, correct?
I believe the email says that he will contact the FBI.
Okay. Do you know, either of you had contact with the FBI? Yes or no, to your knowledge?
At the time, no.
Okay. But then you reaffirmed those engineering concerns in an email to Dr. Fauci, which you say the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, and that after discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome is consistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Again, were you a conspiracy theorist at that time? And did you share these same concerns on the February 1st conference call? Because Dr. Gary went so far as to say, quote, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario when you get from the bat virus or one very similar to it, COVID-19, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides, and all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature, unquote. So then, within a matter of days, something changed. And that's what this committee is trying to get to the bottom of. What happened within that 3-day period between the conference call and the paper that all of a sudden you did a 180 and it couldn't possibly come from a lab, or maybe, but you're all saying that, you know, this was by sure from nature. What happened in those 3 days?
Well, we examined the genomes more closely. We looked at other coronaviruses, and there was some new data that came.
Where did that data come from?
The scientific literature, you know, the publication of the pangolin genomic sequence showed that there was a receptor binding domain that was very close to the...
And exactly what my colleague here brought up.
Yes, exactly.
Okay,
and it was a very
interesting.
important piece of data because it showed that a lot of the theories about, you know, the virus having been engineered or put together in a laboratory were not true, because here was a virus in nature that had a receptor binding domain with exactly the same structure.
I just find it all interesting based on what my other colleague here, the chairman of the committee, said with reply to the issue of the penguins. But Something else that happened between those 2 days is one of your colleagues, who's not here today but was invited, Dr. Rambutt, he said, I don't know if I should say this in committee room or not, but given the blank show that this would happen, if anyone seriously accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural processes. His concern was, would he piss off China? That's what his concern was. So, look, something happened here. Politicians may flip-flop. Scientists do not flip-flop in a matter of 72 hours. And whether it was the fear of accusing communist China for this leak, whether it was needing to get the FBI involved in what that might lead to down the line, whether it was the fact that millions of US dollars had made their way, by the way, to communist China. Interesting chart I have here, $3.7 million. Were any of you aware during any of these, whether it's drafting this paper or conversations with Fauci, that communist China received $3.7 million of American tax dollars, including to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Did that ever come up in any conversations with Dr. Fauci?
It did not.
Okay. Dr. Anderson, no?
It did not, and while I was aware of some of the work, I was not aware of the funding going, because that is obviously irrelevant to understanding the origin itself. I should point out, though, that in terms of labeling people as conspiracy theorists, is that considering a potential lab leak is a perfectly reasonable and scientifically justified question to ask. I myself have asked it. I have not called people that believe or think that this could have come from a lab conspiracy theory.
Okay, well, I'd like to just take my time back because I've run out, and I just only want to acknowledge that it's not just Dr. Redfield, right? We had the Department of Energy come out with their conclusion that they believe it was likely from a lab. It is the FBI that also says it was likely for a lab, and I just wanted the record to reflect that. Thank you.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin, Maryland, for actually 7 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We're all interested in finding out the origins of the COVID-19 epidemic to make sure that such a nightmare never happens again to us, and we need the facts. Some people clearly want to politicize the question. Some people think that the finding that it all started with a lab leak would somehow absolve Donald Trump of his lethally reckless response to the pandemic. Of course, his response was dangerously dysfunctional, regardless of how it got started. And his own advisor on COVID-19, Deborah Birx, said that we lost hundreds of thousands of American lives because of the flaws in the response. But even if the virus came from a lab, as indeed it could have, we don't know that yet, that would only deepen Donald Trump's culpability, because he was the one who repeatedly and enthusiastically praised China's early handling of the pandemic and assured us that he was working closely with President Xi on the response to it. So let's just get the facts straight and leave all the political myth-making aside. Now, we've heard claims repeatedly that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins set up the February 1st, 2020 conference call as part of a plan somehow to suppress the lab leak theory. But the committee majority's own June 2023 subpoena to Dr. Anderson says that it was Dr. Farrar who organized the conference call. Well, which is it? Dr. Anderson, it's my understanding that the conference call was indeed set up by Dr. Farrar so top scientists could discuss SARS-CoV-2 genomic features and whether those features could illuminate the origins of the virus. Is that correct, that it was set up by Dr. Farrar?
That is correct.
Okay. Dr. Farrar provided the agenda and the roster of attendees via email. You can see in the top box here in red the agenda, and in the bottom box in red the roster of attendees. In the agenda, Dr. Farrar assigned himself the role of introducing and defining the focus of the call, setting up desired outcomes, and establishing next steps afterward. Neither Dr. Fauci nor Dr. Collins were assigned roles on this agenda. Dr. Gary, it looks like this was in every material respect Dr. Farrar's call. Is that how you remember it?
It is how I remember it.
And what contributions did Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins make, or did they mostly just listen?
Well, they did mostly just listen. They had very little to offer on the science. I think they were there to gather information.
Okay, now, Dr. Anderson, you said you began yourself with the initial hypothesis that there had been or may have been a lab leak, but you ended up not believing in that theory. Why? How did you change your mind?
I think it's important to understand that we're talking about early hypotheses here on which our thinking over time evolved. And that then led to the conclusions published in a peer-reviewed paper. I would like to point out that this timeline of 3 days, I don't know where that's coming from. The paper was published on the 17th of March, 2020. That's 45 days after this conference call. What's important to understand is that the thinking evolved from initially thinking that this could have been engineered to relatively rapidly discount that idea as being inconsistent with the available evidence. However, the lab leak theory itself, or the idea of a lab leak, can be many different things, and our continued evolution of that then followed that I was quite convinced that maybe it was cultured. And then from there, eventually realized that actually that is also unsupported. And that's what led to the conclusions in proximal origin.
But I have your paper, The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, in which you write, our analyses clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus. Did Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins pressure you to come to this conclusion or to suppress the lab leak theory?
They did not. That is fully a conclusion of the authors on the paper. Okay.
Now, one of the things I admire in what you've been saying is that you follow the scientific method. You say in the conclusion of your paper, although the evidence shows that SARS-CoV-2 is not a purposefully manipulated virus, it is currently impossible to prove or disprove the other theories of its origin described here. In other words, we fundamentally don't know, but have there been papers following your original paper that have caused you to revise the view that you have now and to go back to your original hypothesis?
No, but I will say there has been additional data and analyses, which obviously we have taken all of those into consideration. However, these early conclusions remain to this day.
Okay. Well, let's move on to an email that you sent to your co-authors. You wrote, and this has been, I think, much misunderstood. Our main work over the last couple of weeks has been focused on trying to disprove any type of lab theory. Now, you explained in your opening statement that you meant pursuing the scientific process by which you have an hypothesis which stands unless it's disproven. Is that right? Is that what you meant by that?
That is correct. I'm referring to the concept of what's called falsification, as Chairman Wenstrup mentioned too. Yes.
The falsification of a theory. Yes. All right. So has there been any attempt, to your knowledge, to censor any papers that would contradict the conclusions that you arrived at here? Or put it differently, you mentioned in your opening testimony that Dr. Fauci had encouraged you to write a paper about the lab theory if that's where the evidence took you. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm not aware of whether papers has been censored specifically focused on the lab leak. I will say again, if you look at the scientific evidence, it all points in one direction, which is a single market in the middle of Wuhan in China as the starting point of this pandemic. There are many papers out there that have described potential lab leaks, which are typically using sort of gods of the gaps type of analogies, where you're trying to say that the data is not perfect, so everything remains still possible. And that's something we agree with. As we specifically say in the paper, you cannot disprove or prove any of the hypotheses. of the origin. That was true at the time, and that's still today true.
Well, I just want to commend you for following the scientific method here, for being open to all new evidence and all new data, and not succumbing to a series of political polemics and attacks. Mr. Chairman, thank you very kindly. I yield